Welcome to The Extraordinary Catholic, co-sponsored by the Catholic Education Foundation and the Station of the Cross out of Buffalo, New York. Today we are privileged to welcome to the program an extraordinary Catholic, Brian St. Paul. Brian is the editor of Crisis Magazine and InsideCatholic.com. Once a printed periodical, the now online magazine claims to be a voice for authentic Catholicism in the public square, encouraging difference and debate among their many writers, columnists, and bloggers. All of the bloggers and columnists, and most of its feature writers, are faithful Catholics. The magazine's direction is largely led by Brian. Welcome, Brian St. Paul. Thank you, Brian, for joining us. We are very indeed privileged to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
Tell us about, for those who don't know intimately, what the mission of Crisis Magazine, Inside Catholic is. How'd you get started, and how you doing?
Well, Crisis Magazine itself actually started 25 years ago. It was founded by Michael Novak and Ralph McInerney, and they founded it in response to the bishops' letters from the early 80s about nuclear war, about poverty and that. And they felt that the bishops' prescriptions were unnecessarily partisan. In other words, they were always kind of the standard Democratic Party line. And so they wanted to create a publication that offered the conservative response to that. Now, over the years, the Crisis Magazine morphed and developed. And now, of course, we've moved entirely online, and we've become InsideCatholic.com. And we have actually broadened our focus. And so what we're trying to do with InsideCatholic.com is provide a kind of marketplace of ideas for faithful Catholics. So all of the positions enunciated and defended on the website are allowable to faithful Catholics. These are things that we can disagree about, we can argue about, but in the end we're all Catholic brothers and sisters. And so instead of approaching it from a partisan angle, we wanted to approach it from an angle of allowing charitable debate, discussion. And we honestly believe that if given that kind of thing, that kind of conversation, that the truth will win out. And so things have gone well so far, and it's been well received.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm interested in two aspects of what you said. One is, how successful was the original Crisis in accomplishing its objective of giving an alternative to what you call the Democratic platform?
Yes, actually, it was quite successful. In fact, a lot of people actually credit or blame Crisis for the 2000 and 2004 victories by President Bush. The former editor of Crisis, the former publisher of Crisis, Dale Hudson, was at that time the head of Catholic outreach for the White House and for Governor Bush at the time in the late 90s and then in the 2000 election. So actually, Crisis was quite influential. Now, a lot of people aren't happy about the influence they had with the election, and some of us have our own regrets. But there it is. I mean, it was successful. It was influential, and I think that same influence, maybe less ideological influence, has been carried over into the website.
Now, how did the bishops react to Crisis' initial success?
Well, that's a great question. It really depends on the bishop. Some bishops have always supported us, have always been very friendly towards us. Of course, Bishop Chaput in Denver has been wonderful. Myers. I mean, we've had close relationships with a number of bishops that continue today. Other bishops were, of course, more critical. Any bishop who at the time would have found himself on the left was clearly quite critical of not only what Crisis was doing, but the influence and the weight that it began to kind of swing around. And so it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag, but I'm happy to say that the response, I'd say, over the last 3 or 4 years has been more positive. Now, some of that's the development of the magazine and website, and some of that's the changing of the guard among the bishops in the United States. So a little combination of both, I think.
And I would imagine the broadening of the mission of the magazine to present all views that are acceptable to Catholicism.
Right, exactly. Because I think the bishops, no matter where they fall politically or socially, we recognize, all Catholics recognize that there's a need for this. We don't have a place where we can come together and really discuss these things. I mean, one of the things that you see frequently on not just Catholic websites, but Catholic publications and things like that, and television programs, is they tend to speak to one demographic of faithful Catholic. And so the more traditional Catholics are all strongly pro-life, but they don't tend to get involved in other social justice issues, whereas the Catholic progressives or progressive Catholics tend to downplay maybe the pro-life stuff, even though they're anti-abortion, and they focus on other things like immigration and poverty issues. And so there needs to be a place where we all come together and discuss these things, because, of course, a full Catholic will have some of both, a little bit of both. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide that forum for people to complete their Catholicism, I guess I'd say.
I'm interested in how you would distinguish the work of Crisis versus a Newhouse's First Things.
Good question. Father Newhouse's First Things, which is a fabulous journal, there are a couple differences. We were frequently compared to First Things when Crisis was a print magazine. I always disagreed with the comparison. First Things is an academic journal. Crisis was a popular level magazine. Also, First Things was actually an ecumenical journal, so it was not specifically Catholic, although obviously Father Newhouse and a number of the staff are Catholic, and it's a very Catholic-friendly magazine, or journal rather. So Crisis was a popular level Catholic magazine that focused on issues in the world through the lens of the Catholic faith. And so it was a little bit different. Also, the politics were different. First Things tends to be neoconservative, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I think that's a fair description. Now, Crisis magazine was also considered neoconservative, but I don't think that was a proper label. Even when Dale Hudson was running it, Dale was quite skeptical of Israel and our support of Israel and the treatment of Palestinians, which is, of course, not something you find among neoconservatives at all. So I don't know that we were neoconservative, whereas I do think that First Things is and continues to be to a degree.
Okay. Now, how do you... I'm not even sure I know how to define a neoconservative or a neocon, but how would you attribute the neocon to Catholicism? How would that manifest itself?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that's part of the debate now. I see some problems with neoconservatism and the way that it fits in with Catholicism. Part of the problem is, as you point out, Joe, is that there is no stable definition of neoconservatism. I mean, it tends to be a position that is very pro-Israel, that believes in using government to, not necessarily shrinking government, but using government more efficiently, and then they couple that also with the use of the U.S. military to create democracies around the world. So it's very much a kind of a Wilsonian project as regards foreign policy for planting democracies throughout the world. So that's how I would define it or describe neoconservatism. My concerns as that regards Catholicism is in a number of areas. One, primarily, of course, the use of the military. That's a touchy thing with the Catholic just war teaching. Number two, the issue of, insofar as neoconservatives don't necessarily want to shrink the size of the state, I think that's a problem with Catholic social teaching, because, of course, we have principles like subsidiarity, where the lowest, the function of a government should be done at the lowest level, the level most approaching the local community, which doesn't work with big government, either Republican big government or Democratic big government. So I think that's another problem with at least the neoconservatives who do not endorse shrinking the government. So there are a couple issues. I think that the debate is going on right now. I think it will continue after the next election as people begin to reflect on President Bush's term. And so it's an interesting debate to have.
Oh, extraordinarily interesting. I had a priest friend of mine, or a priest that married me about 30 years ago that I hadn't seen in a long time. I visited him, and he called me a neocon, but he really wanted to get under the skin of what makes us neocons really tick. Right. I didn't even know what I was, but but he tried to get at
the term gets thrown around. it's hard to pin down. It's hard to pin down.
I know, it really is. Now, what's the process for selecting articles, selecting topics, and selecting authors, and how does blogging get into this whole thing?
We get story ideas from a number of sources. I mean, obviously the staff, the editorial staff, we have our own interests, and we're always coming up with ideas. But we also work with a stable of writers who are all faithful Catholics, but they come from a variety of perspectives. So we have someone like a Jeff Tucker from the von Mises Institute, or the von Mises Institute, who's a kind of an anarcho-capitalist. And then we have Eric Pavlet, who's one of our bloggers, who's a pro-life Democrat. Then, of course, we have Dale Hudson, who's one of our bloggers and columnists, and he's a pretty fervent Republican. So we've got a pretty good range of people. We're about to add a kind of a pseudo-socialist as well. So we get ideas from those individuals because they are out there and they're covering their own beats. You know, they have their own agendas, their own interests, and so they can bring that to the table in suggesting stories. And then finally, one of the things that we do on staff among the writers, the bloggers, is that we're always on the internet. We're always looking at blogs, we're reading articles, and we're looking at the things that people are debating and people are disagreeing over. And when you find something that someone disagrees over, there's a great topic for an article. And so that gives us a lot of ideas as well. So it's the article topics come pouring in from our writers and also from what we find through our own research and interests.
In case you have just joined us, this is The Extraordinary Catholic. We are talking with Brian St. Paul, editor of Crisis Magazine and InsideCatholic.com. What do you see as the hot Catholic topics in the upcoming election?
Well, I think, of course, the war. The war will be big. I don't know how what role abortion will play. And I say that for this reason. I'm presuming that Obama will be the Democratic nominee, and I think, barring something really unusual, that's a pretty close to a done deal. Obama has a radical record on abortion. However, John McCain, while he has, I guess, just by the score of it, he has a 100% pro-life record, he nevertheless does support limited testing on stem cells, embryonic stem cells, as well as, in addition to that, he's not exactly a pro-life firebrand.
Right.
So I don't know that the abortion issue will be a big matter for debate among the campaigns, although I do think the Catholics themselves will bring it up, and other pro-life Christians, of course. But I think, I think the war is the big one, and I think that a lot of the other things are just simply areas where Catholics and the general population will agree. The economy, what should be done there? Is it government intervention, or is the problem government intervention? And that's a legitimate debate. And so I think that the Catholics, we're not a monolithic group, so Catholics share the same concerns that other Americans share. But I think we can add the pro-life issue, and then particularly the war, because of the way, I guess, that it has gone, and the fairly clear concerns from Rome about the war, both in the build-up and then in the execution of it.
Do you think there's a Catholic vote anymore?
That's a good question. Here's an area where Deal and I disagree to a point. There is a faithful Catholic vote. Let me rephrase that. There was a faithful Catholic vote, I think, that you could find in the numbers. The people who went to Mass weekly tended to vote Republican. I don't know that will be true this cycle, because John McCain, I don't think, instills enough interest in Catholics. The war has gone badly, and I think some Catholics will be attracted to Obama just for the change, just for apart from the positions, just for something new. So I don't know. My guess is that the Catholic vote will not be determinative this cycle. I don't think it will be.
Well, that's interesting, because Obama, who I've been watching closely, has said some pretty provocative things.
Yes.
The thing I heard most recently was he made a comment about him wanting to bring up his children with good cultural values, but if they made a mistake, he would not want them to be punished with a baby.
Right.
It's pretty provocative. And how?
Oh, yes.
And how on earth can any Catholic subscribe to that? And what kind of dialogue or debate in your magazine or on your website will you participate in highlighting things like that don't necessarily get good coverage in the mass media to give the
Right, I actually wrote about that.
Oh, did
in fact,
you?
I did a little bit on that. I found a very funny political cartoon that I posted on the blog on that very quote. That's what we do. We cover issues that are important to our readership that are ignored by the mainstream press, and obviously that's a fairly shocking statement. It's a revealing statement because it shows you how he looks at how he views a child. Of course, the mainstream media didn't care, primarily because they share that view, so it was nothing extraordinary or unusual for them to hear that. So that one of the things we do is just in reporting it, we're separating ourselves from the mainstream media, and we're calling attention to the fact that there's another way to look at these things. And so that's primarily how we'll do it. Because this election cycle is so unusual, we are having a good number of Obama supporters who are Catholics and who profess to be pro-life as well, who are coming to the site and commenting and giving the reasons why they're supporting Obama. And I'm finding that very interesting, although obviously I disagree.
Yeah, I'm interested in how do they react when they come to defend him to that quotation?
That I think, well, their reaction is kind of the same as the Obama campaign, and that's simply that it was an offhand comment. He misspoke. His point was that the life of a young mother is a difficult one, and so he would want to prevent his children from going through that. So that's what they would do. The statement itself was pretty shocking. I don't go too far with it because he has distanced himself from that. So since he's given that, I don't take it too far, and I think that there are many things in his record that will be better fodder for debate and critique.
Okay, well, you're a lot nicer person than I am, so.
Southerners. Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. Your work is very interesting. How did you get involved, Brian?
That's actually a really good question. I was the associate director of a health institute here in Baltimore, an international health institute, and one of my functions was rating medical studies, evaluating them, if a study was structured well, if it was statistically significant, etc. And I did a lot of that kind of research, which had absolutely nothing to do with Catholicism, but I had a bachelor's in philosophy and a master's in theology, and I had done some missionary work, some apologetics work. I'd worked for Envoy magazine. I'd worked for the Legionaries of Christ at one point. I was a door-to-door evangelist. And so I had that all in my background. Oh, and I taught at a Catholic high school. I had that in my background. And so when I was at the Health Institute, my now wife was working at Crisis, and the position of editor came open. And so she mentioned me to Deal, and Deal asked me to come down, and I went to his house and met him, and he offered me the job right there. So I decided to jump in. My interest was that Crisis, although I was not myself a staunch Republican, I'm actually a libertarian, but my interest in Crisis was that it bridged the gap between a Catholic publication and a secular publication, and that's where I think we need to be. There is a place for exclusively Catholic publications to build up the body of Christ, and no question about that, but I think there's also a large and largely unfilled role of kind of a bridge publication, the magazines that cover Catholic issues, but they also cover secular matters, and there are articles in there that would be interesting to secular readers as well. And so what that tended to do was it would bring secular readers who would want to read about some political matter or some aspect of junk science, and they would also see the other articles, the more evangelical articles. And so we would be not only informing, building up the body of Christ, but we would also be evangelizing the non-Catholics who are coming to the magazine. And so we follow that same dynamic in the website as well.
What would be an example of what you'd consider a secular article?
Or an article that would have interest to secular readers. We did a very good piece on global warming. We did a wonderful piece on, now that piece was quite skeptical of global warming. We did another piece looking at the question of AIDS and condoms in Africa. Now, obviously, this has a huge Catholic component because, of course, the Catholic Church is constantly being hammered for prohibiting African Catholics from using prophylactics. But we actually did a story that looked at just the question of the effectiveness of condoms in stemming AIDS in Africa, and in fact found that they actually have made the problem worse, and that a nation like Uganda, which institutes a policy of chastity and monogamy primarily, they see their AIDS rates plummet. And so that was an interesting article, and that got a lot of attention from non-Catholics as well. So there are a lot of subjects out there. There are a lot of stories and matters that can be discussed that would be of interest to a wide range of people. And so we look for those kinds of things in addition to the Catholic-specific articles that we run. In case you have just joined us, this is The Extraordinary Catholic. We are talking with Brian St. Paul, editor of Crisis Magazine and InsideCatholic.com. Do you do any muckraking in terms of that type of journalism where you expose issues that have not been exposed? Yes. I mean, obviously muckraking has taken on a negative tone where it wasn't necessarily the case, originally, of course. Right. And so, in the classic style of muckraking, we do that. We we bring up the things that some people would rather not have seen. We try not to get personal. That's not, personal things or matters are off limits for us. But, insofar as it touches on public policy or happens in the public square, that's perfectly legitimate. And so, we do no favors to anyone by ignoring those things. So we don't. We call attention to. Oh, could you give me an example of some expose that you did? Yes, actually. We ran an article called The High Price of Priestly Pedophilia 6 months before the Boston Globe broke that story. And so we talked about John Gogan. We talked about a lot of the things that Boston covered. Wow. And now, let me be very clear. The Boston Globe did a tremendous job on their research. So they in no way piggybacked on us. I'm not claiming that at all. Right. But the fact is, we were on that story 6 months before that broke, and we got hammered for it. I mean, we had people canceling the magazine. We were attacked by other Catholic publications because we are daring to bring up this dirty little secret. And I think that's something that Catholic World Report faced as well. They did something in the mid-'90s on that, and I think they got hammered as well. So, that's an example. And, of course, 6 months later, the big Boston Globe story broke, and we were vindicated. Great. But it was pretty hairy up. I bet. It was pretty hairy up until then, I can tell you that. Great example. Now, in your research on it, I have sort of an axe to grind on that issue because it's presented in the popular press as pedophilia, and right? And I think the lion's share of it was actually homosexuality. Precisely. Yeah. In fact, it was. I mean, the technical term is ephebophilia. It was abuse of post-pubescent teenagers, which is terrible. Obviously, we're not claiming anything. That's awful, but it is not pedophilia. You're right. It's a form of homosexuality. It's homosexual intercourse with teenagers. So, agreed. Right. And I was referencing. That's a great example. I just got my issue of Father Fessio's magazine, The Reporter. Yes. And they did an expose on the silence of CRS in terms of their position on the use of condoms in fighting AIDS, and that actually was a cover story. Oh, good. So that would be an example of what I'd call a muckraking. Oh, yes, yes, but in the positive sense. In the positive sense. Exactly. And Catholic World Report's very good with that. And again, that is a compliment. Yes. Now, for those who don't, I want to get a little more into your background, but for those who don't know a lot about your boss, Diehl Hudson, can you describe him? Yeah, Diehl, what is he? He was a philosophy professor. He is a Texan, which comes out in everything he does and says if you talk to him. His particular interest, he's very much a Republican, but he is his republicanism, he argues, comes out of his Thomism. Okay. And so I think that all of his opinions emerge from some interpretation of St. Thomas. he's a great devotee of literature, show tunes. I remember the first time I met him when I was invited to talk about the open position. We met in his basement. He was smoking a cigar, and I was not in any way a smoker at that time, but he gave me a cigar, and I was trying to impress him, of course, because this was Diehl Hudson, and so
right.
I had unwrapped it, and I cut the cigar, and I lit it, and was smoking it, and he kind of leaned back and said, "Brian, I need to tell you something." And I said, "Well, sure, Diehl. What do you need to tell me?" He goes, "Well, Brian, you're smoking the wrong end." So my first meeting with Diehl Hudson, but he overlooked that and hired me, and we have gotten along quite well since then. So that's Diehl Hudson. He's got his imperfections. Heaven knows he does not hide that. Right. But he's a good man. He's a good guy.
That's good. Now, Saint Augustine plays a role in your life, or played a role in your life?
Oh, very much so.
Can you describe
yes,
that?
Saint Augustine is my, if I could call it, my life saint. I like the way that Father Benedict Groeschel approaches Saint Augustine. He considers him the same. He is his lifetime spiritual teacher. And if I recall, I think he even refers to him as Father Augustine, which is a habit that I've taken up myself. I think, for me, of course, just on the points, St. Augustine was the most influential mind in the history of Christianity, outside of the Scriptures. And I think that's kind of beyond debate. But for my stars, what I like about Augustine is that he brought such passion to his intellectual work. And when you read the Confessions, I mean, that not only was that the first example of that form of literature in Western history, the confession, the literary confession, but it's a masterpiece that holds up today. I mean, I remember the first time I read it, I was a philosophy student, and I was not spiritually minded. And for me, I thought, oh my heavens, he's praying again. We'll skip over the prayers and let's get to the philosophy. And that was my experience the first time. The second time, it was an entirely different thing. I was more mature, and it just tore me open. The passion, the anguish with which he writes, the regret, but this new discovery. And so, for me, it opened up an entirely new part of my spiritual life. It gave me a chance to see my return to the Catholic Church in a new way, because of course Augustine, he was not a revert, but of course his mother was a Catholic, and so insofar as that was true when he became Catholic, it wasn't simply a cold conversion, but it was a kind of a return to a Catholic family. So Augustine was profoundly influential on me, and continues to be so. In fact, I have a first-class relic of St. Augustine that I wore in my tuxedo when my wife and I got married. And so he continues to be important to me and accompany me throughout my life.
Right. I've enjoyed this interview very much, and I would invite you, because there's so much more to cover with you. I think I would invite you back for a future show if you would be available.
Oh, I'd love to.
And I would be remiss in not mentioning that Diehl Hudson played a big role in your life because you married his assistant, Zoe Romanowski, correct?
Right. Well, she was the director of development.
Okay.
But, yes, she was there at Crisis.
Okay.
Now, I have to say, though, to give full credit, Pat Madrid, the editor of Envoy magazine, introduced us.
Okay.
So I have to give him the nod.
I do remember when Diehl used to have the television show on EWTN. I remember seeing Zoe appear periodically.
That's right. Yes, whenever he needed to be interviewed, she would interview him because she can handle him. Okay. She can get him to stop talking.
Yeah. And what's the website, Brian, that you're working on?
The website is www.insidecatholic.com.
Okay.
That's all one word, InsideCatholic.com.
Well, thank you, Brian, very much. This has been a very interesting interview. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you so much. And I'll be talking to you shortly.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us for today's Extraordinary Catholic. We hope you have found the program inspirational and informative, and truly hope you can join us again. I'm Joe Indelicato.